Deep within the crumbling remains of the occupied territories of the great southern land, one man has discovered that not only has his paranoid nightmares become a reality, he is also completely all out of bubble gum. Put on those sunglasses and take a glimpse behind the curtain of control as we join our host, live from an undisclosed location, Mr. David Thrussell.
Hello and welcome to episode 15 of All Out of Bubblegum. I am your humble host, David Thrussell, accompanied by Ed on the technicals. Welcome. We've got a lot to get through to today, so I won't tarry. Ed, let's roll 1 week in the Flu World Order. Technical problems there. That's what happens with live TV. Anyway, never mind. Onward and upward. Ed, if you're able, can you pull up that graphic? They wouldn't need to censor us if we were wrong. This is a sentiment that I heartily agree with. We are suffering censorship and restrictions and shadow bannings all over the place. If you're watching this, the majority of people who watch All Out of Bubblegum watch it on the Cafe Locked Out channel, which is heavily restricted and shadow banned and all those nefarious things. If you do happen to catch us by some slight miracle, just remember, they wouldn't need to censor us if we were wrong. So we'll take that on the chin. The heavy censorship that we are suffering, we'll take it as a sign of their desperation. Ed, I don't know if you've got that card handy, but if you go to alloutofbubblegum.net, oh, look at that, fantastic. Alloutofbubblegum.net, you can find all previous episodes of All Out of Bubblegum at that address, alloutofbubblegum.net. You can also support the show there, which would be greatly appreciated. And today, to start off the show, I wanted to give you actually two quick video recommendations, actually. I'm ironically, perhaps, I do realize I'm appearing to you right now via the video platform. I'm a Luddite, but I still can figure that out. But I'm not generally that big a fan of video and whatnot, as you may be aware. I'm quite bookish. But I did want to recommend two videos for you this week, and I wanted to recommend them very highly. The first one is a fellow, I believe he's an American. I've seen 2 or 3 of his presentations before, and I've always found them very interesting. His name is Larkin Rose. That's him there. He's the guy on the right, not the demonic succubus on the left, but the fellow on the right. His name is Larkin Rose. I'm told he's in the sort of anarchist milieu or something. I don't know much about him, but as I've said, I've seen him 2 or 3 times before, and unusually for me, I've pretty much agreed with everything I've ever seen him say, which is an unusual thing for me to find that. And in this video that I'm recommending to you, it's on YouTube. He dodges and weaves the censorship, and you'll see that if you watch the video. The video is called Biden's Babblings, and it's about the recent supposed US President Joe Biden's speech, where he had this remarkably totalitarian backdrop with the red underlighting and the vehement shaking of fists abuse and anger. It looks like they'd parachuted him, well, at least his animated corpse, in from V for Vendetta or some other sort of totalitarian landscape. And he riled on about MAGA Republicans and destroying democracy and all this, nonsense. But what's interesting, and I highly recommend this Larkin Rose video to you. Larkin Rose has got a healthy sense of humor, and he dissects that Joe Biden speech, which I haven't seen. All I've seen is the plethora, the armada of memes that people have sent me about it, which is always a good sign. So I know I haven't seen Joe Biden's actual speech, but Larkin Rose dissecting it is pretty funny. He makes the case that the globalists' propaganda is clearly faltering, that they're a bit desperate, and that it's fairly tone deaf to prop up your sort of, walking corpse of a supposed president in front of this clearly totalitarian background, enunciating these strident and divisive slogans about, half of the US electorate or whatever, and how they're destroying democracy and blah, 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 blah. Larkin Rose makes the very salient point that this is a fairly desperate maneuver, actually. This is the propaganda of desperation, and it's clumsy and tone deaf and a bit incompetent, actually. So he actually, ends in a fairly upbeat manner when he dissects that video, which I think is great, because I think it's great to be able to identify that the evil empire's propaganda is faltering and weak. No, we're not out of the weeds yet, and I'm not suggesting that for a moment, but it's great, and I would give a round of good cheer that the evil empire's propaganda is looking pretty weak and pretty clumsy right now. If they have to resort to incompetent, tone-deaf stunts like that, that's a pretty good sign. And that links to the mass censorship that is going on. You put those two things together, and that tells you fairly clearly that they're fighting what's called militarily, they're fighting a rearguard action. They are, in some sense, in retreat if they have to make clumsy, oafish moves like that. The second video that I wanted to recommend to you is this fellow here. I've recommended him before. He's an Irish fellow. His updates from Ireland are always interesting. His name is Dave Cullen. His channel is called Computing Forever. And the video, I believe it's the latest video on his channel, is called The End of Plenty. And he does start talking about this era of abundance that many, not all, but many of us have lived through in recent decades, and how that's about to clearly come to an end. But also, like the Larkin Rose video, he does also point out that there are great positives in this as well, and he also notes that the propaganda is getting more and more desperate day after day. The propaganda from the evil empire, the globalists, is getting more and more desperate day after day, and that's a good thing. When people are desperate, they get clumsy and they make mistakes, and that is something that we should cheer about and receive some small but realistic morale boost. And both of those videos are completely realistic about the situation. They don't pull punches, they don't give false hope, but they do give some small morale boost, in that the evil empire is obviously faltering, and that's something that we should rejoice in, and also recognize that a lot of people out there have put in a lot of efforts to chip away at what seems sometimes like the unassailable tsunami of propaganda that the globalists have at their disposal. And they do. They completely control the mainstream media, and I would argue most of the alternative media as well. And they completely control the political class and academia, etc., etc., obviously. But nevertheless, lots of yes, I understand your point there. Yes, we all, well, not all, but a lot of us can feel that the next shoe is about to drop. I completely agree. But still, it's great to see some obvious and frankly quite incompetent faltering on their part, even though they have these enormous resources. And that does mean that on a grassroots level, lots and lots of people's agitation and lots of people's hunger for the truth is in fact having an effect, a positive effect. So I think that's a great thing. Now, some quick plugs. I wanted to give you a quick plug. My friends at New Dawn magazine. This is an Australian magazine produced locally, full of local and international content. I believe this latest edition is in Australian newsagents right now. Yes, that's true. If you go to your local newsagent, you could well find this subversive publication right there next to, The Conversation and Clio and Lord knows what other rubbish. Right in the midst of all that claptrap, you can find this really quite magnificent magazine, New Dawn magazine. Full disclaimer, produced by friends of mine. I write for them on occasion. But I do recommend, if you want to engage in the real world, if you want to get offline but still engage with information, this is a great way to do it. It's in print form. They Mandela effect, not aside from that, they probably can't change this easily anyway. So New Dawn magazine, I highly recommend it. Also, if you're watching this show on Wednesday the 7th of September Melbourne, Australia time, we have a No Goat show live tonight in Melbourne at the Alex Theatre in St Kilda at 7 p.m. Our special guest is the heretic doctor, Dr. William Bay from Queensland. If you want to engage in the joust, in the wrestling of free speech and open debate and open discussion, if you like the potential friction and the freedom that is generated by that, come down to the No Goat show tonight. It's at the Alex Theatre in St Kilda, Melbourne, Australia, 7 p.m. All right. That's right. Absolutely. Not just myself, but also the other figures from Cafe Locked Out, the No Goat show, will be live in the flesh. It's not all about us. Actually, it's largely about the audience. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your ideas, your suggestions, your strategies, your solutions, and let's have a discussion about it. Such a crazy old school idea. People having a free and open discussion. I know, extraordinary. Anyway, you can do it in the flesh at the No Goat show. And we've got a show coming up actually in Warrnambool, which is in regional Victoria, Australia, on the 28th of September. So if you're in that area, in the area of Warrnambool, please come along. All right, Ed, without further ado, shall we move on to the Forbidden Book Club?
Draw the curtains and expand your mind. It's time to get textual as we traverse the illicit pages of Wrongthink in the Forbidden Book Club.
Yes, indeed. It's my favorite part of the show, the Forbidden Book Club. I'm bookish. I'm a book nerd. As Ed just remarked off air, I am surrounded by towers and mountains of books here. I'm not ashamed of that. I'm trying to come out of my book closet. So today we're going to do a very, very interesting book on the Forbidden Book Club. It's this book here, False Flags Over Europe, A Modern History of State-Fabricated Terror, by Nick Kollerstrom, Dr. Nick Kollerstrom, PhD. False Flags Over Europe, A Modern History of State-Fabricated Terror. Now, if you're a long-time viewer of All Out of Bubblegum, you may recognize that name, Dr. Nick Kollerstrom. He also wrote this book, which we have covered before, Terror on the Tube, Behind the Veil of the Seventh, an investigation. This book is a kind of sequel to that book, False Flags Over Europe. And it's a compendium where Kollerstrom looks at each chapter is devoted to one particular terrorist attack over recent years in Europe. And I'm putting terrorists in very heavy air quotes. Kollerstrom makes the argument, as you can see in the subtitle, A Modern History of State-Fabricated Terror. Now, you might wonder who Nick Kollerstrom is. Ed, we've got a photo of him there that you can pull up. There he is, dapper fellow. Look, he used to be a somewhat establishment mainstream figure. He was a member of the British Royal Society. He had a career, a flourishing career as a scientific historian until he went off the reservation, until he engaged in wrong think, and he's since been banished to the margins. So it's entirely fitting that we should cover a book by Nick Kollerstrom on the Forbidden Book Club, because his books are very difficult to find these days and getting harder in the present atmosphere of censorship. They are getting harder and harder to find. This book, the book that we're going to discuss today, False Flags Over Europe, is not an easy book to find. I do, however, highly recommend it to you. There isn't enough time today for me to go into all the detail, obviously, that he lays out in the book. I'm just going to cover some key chapters that will give you a flavor of his argument. I'm going to present information and arguments and small speculations that are all in this book. So I'm going to present to you as unfiltered as I possibly can manage the information he has gathered and his arguments. I'm going to present those to you. Now, you may ask, why, and you should always ask, why is this book relevant? What's this got to do with the price of oranges? Who cares? Okay, fair enough question. I'm going to try and answer that. And I think if you make it to the end of this presentation, you'll completely understand why this book is still and was always incredibly relevant. The first argument I would make in that area is actually comes from Sherlock Holmes, actually, the great fictional detective. No, that's Sherlock. Well, that's Basil Rathbone, the great actor playing Sherlock Holmes in the great Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes films of the 1940s, which, if you haven't seen, I highly recommend to you. The Hound of the Baskervilles, Woman in Green, blah, 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 all those great Basil Rathbone films from the 1940s. They do not grow old. They are fantastic. Anyway, Sherlock Holmes, fictional character, written by, written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. Okay, I'm going to confess to you, I'm a big fan. There's a particular Sherlock Holmes story called The Adventure of the Silver Blaze. I think, there we go. There's a cover image for the book of it. It's a short story, but it's a reasonably long short story, and it concerns a a famous racing horse that disappears and its owner is murdered. But there's a great quote from Sherlock Holmes that's in The Adventure of the Silver Blaze. Ed, if you can pull it up, it should be there somewhere. There it is. Okay, so there's some detective, I don't think it's Lestrade, I think it's one of the other detectives from Scotland Yard, who is speaking to Sherlock Holmes in the story, and the detective says, "Is there any other point to which you would wish to draw my attention?" And Sherlock Holmes responds, "To the curious incident of the dog in the night time." And the detective responds, "But the dog did nothing in the night time." And Holmes responds, "That was the curious incident." And it's quite famous, this interaction is quite famous as the dog that didn't bark. That meaning the absence of something that you would have expected to happen. There was an intruder in the stables, in the stalls, who stole this famous racing horse, murdered the owner, and you would have expected the dog, when a stranger entered the premises and was committing nefarious acts, you would have expected the dog to bark. And so the absence of something, the absence of some information or response or data, can also be a very telling thing. And I would argue in this case, in the proposition of this book, False Flags Over Europe, the absence of terror attacks, fundamentalist Islamic terrorist attacks, the absence of those over the last 2.5 years, that's interesting, isn't it? Because prior to that, cast your mind back, activate your memory, if you will, we were besieged. I kept a tally because I pay attention to these things. I felt like every 2 to 3 months, kind of like clockwork, there over the last 2 decades, since September 11, basically, there, like clockwork, there would be some terrorist attack, some terrorist outrage of some kind. Every 2 or 3 months, there was one. We even had them in sleepy, dopey Australia. We even had them, and they had plenty across Europe and in America and the UK and in other places, Bali, for example, and so on and so forth. There was, and I've discussed this before on the show, I've called it the architecture of fear in the past. There was this, I would argue, highly constructed rubric, this structure, this infrastructure of fear that was people were being bombarded with on a very regular basis. And if you know psychology 101, basically, frightened people are highly obedient. Frightened people are automatically drawn to authority. They become much more obedient towards authority, much more compliant. I don't think that that's an accident at all. In fact, I think that is a deliberate strategy. And the dog that didn't bark is, we had basically 2 decades of this fear paralysis of the public worked through these terrorist attacks, quote unquote. And then all of a sudden, the world caught a cold and they all vanished. It's almost like the people who were running the terrorist attacks got a little bit busy running some other kind of operation. It's almost like there's actually a reasonably small number of people who were running those terrorist attacks, and they got a little bit busy doing something else, or they decided, their researchers into human psychology told them that you can't be frightening people, you can't be frightening the herd, the flock, the cattle from too many directions at once. Okay, the fear needs to be reasonably focused. It needs to be fairly clear and accessible and discernible to them. You can't be bouncing them around like ping pong balls. So the dog that didn't bark 2.5 years ago. I mean, we were bombarded with all these insane beheading videos and explosions all over Europe. In Europe, every couple of months there for a while, there'd be some, undesirable slitting people's throats or beheadings, bombs, cars crashing, trucks crashing into people, blah, 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 blah. We even had them in Melbourne, Australia. We even had the proprietor of a very famous restaurant in Melbourne, Australia, Pellegrini's, who was murdered in one of these attacks. And a lot of, I know a lot of people who knew the guy. And there was one in Sydney at the Lint Cafe, which was a highly dubious event on all sorts of levels. But we're just going to focus today. We don't have enough time to go into all of them, and it will probably be a little overwhelming, the amount of detail. So we're just going to focus on a couple of ones that are highlighted in this book, False Flags Over Europe. And in this book, Kollerstrom does elucidate his opinion, which I think is interesting, that he posits the hypothesis that there could well be a small team of operatives who actually are running these or were running these terror events, and they would skip from country to country. He noticed, and I concur with him, that there was a real pattern to these events, a very unmistakable pattern, an unmistakable playbook to these events. And I think that pattern recognition is a very important way of trying to understand and analyze our world and our environment. And that playbook, and there's a number of elements to that playbook, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but some of the most obvious ones, which are telltale signs that something is off, something is not organic or natural or real about these events. I'll just mention a couple. And they're predictable. And every one of these events that I will mention today from the book has these same signs. The first one is that there is always a terror drill beforehand. 9/11 had this. The granddaddy of dubious terrorist attacks had a number of drills happening concurrently. Supposed terrorists were crashing planes into buildings. Yes, you may be onto something there. There always has to be a scapegoat. The finger always has to be pointed at some group can be demonized. That it was Muslim, and it was obvious actually. So there's always in that playbook, there's always a terror drill beforehand. Niven had a bunch of these NORAD drills going on, so that there was dozens, perhaps hundreds of false radar blips were inserted in the radar system, so people didn't know what was real blip and what was a false one. And also, apparently, if you look into these things in detail, you'll notice that most US's fighter, their fighter jet would, patrol, especially the eastern seaboard around New York and Washington D.C., were engaged in this drill. They were, some of them were up in Canada and Alaska and were not able to. And every one of these terror events that we're going to discuss today has this same thing. It has terror drill. Often, either it's the day before or a couple of days before, but it's on the day of the attack. The authority, police and the local government, what have you, first responders are running a drill. Often the drill is chillingly identical to what actually happens on the day. That's a giveaway. That's a way that you can mask your preparations to pull off this fraudulent event. You can mask your weapons and your infrastructure and hide it in a drill. The second obvious part of the playbook is that these supposed terrorists happened to scatter their ID documents, their identifying documents, passports, driver's licenses, whatever. They seem to scatter them conveniently at the scene of the crime. They drop them conveniently at the scene of the crime. This always happens, and it happens for the reason that the people running these events need to establish the ID, the identity of the people they want to blame for them. You saw this with 9/11, and we'll go into that in a second. You see this at everyone's events. I'll give you a couple of examples today, where by some miracle, even though buildings are in flames and collapsing and all these terrible things are happening and people are dying in horrible, horrible ways, somehow, by some miracle, a plane supposedly crashes into a building and bursts into a ball game, but a paper passport survives in pristine condition and falls, 60, 70 flights down to the ground and is found by someone from the FBI in condition, etc., etc., etc. This always happens. And there you go. There's one of the 9/11 hijackers. His passport was found in pristine condition. Yes, at the on the ground on September 11. Little hard to believe. That's right. Look at that destruction up there. There's Muhammad Atta, the supposed leader of the 9/11 hijackers. It's not a story that I believe all the details of. Let's put it mildly like that. But his ID, his driver's license was found. His passport was found. They're all found in pristine condition at the scene of the crime. Frankly, I'm going to say it's unbelievable. And the third aspect of the playbook that is always the same is the destruction of evidence, the wanton destruction of evidence. A crime is committed, a terrorist attack, quote unquote. There are casualties, people die, it's horrible, people are wounded, and yet there is this wanton destruction of evidence. This happens on every single occasion, and the reasons, once you understand this structure, once you understand that these attacks are on some level, not all levels, but on some level they are false. They are not being by the people who are being blamed for them. Then the destruction of evidence becomes really, really obvious, doesn't it? So there we have from above, the towers on 9/11 collapsing into plumes of smoke. Horrible event, mass casualties. I don't condone or celebrate it in any way, shape, or form, but I do have grave doubts about the official narrative, and I think the reasons for my grave doubts will become very, very clear. So there we have an aerial view of the towers collapsing. You're talking about mass destruction of buildings, concrete being pulverized, steel girders collapsing, etc., etc. There are the steel girders. But were these steel girders studied? Were they forensically studied to see what had actually happened? They may have yielded clues as to what exactly hit the buildings and why they collapsed in that very odd manner that they did, that looked a bit like a controlled demolition. But no, the scrap metal, this crime scene evidence, was hastily gathered up and shipped offshore, shipped overseas, hastily gathered up. Tens of thousands of tons of this scrap metal from the girders in the World Trade Center buildings that collapsed on 9/11 was gathered up, stuck on these barges as quickly as they could possibly do it, and then sent to Malaysia and China, I believe, to be recycled in an awful hurry. Gosh, you'd think that's the behavior of a criminal. A criminal wants to destroy crime scene evidence. So that is a fairly typical aspect of this playbook. That is destruction of evidence. Now, we have discussed it before, but we'll go into it in brief detail. Terror on the Tube was the earlier Nick Kollerstrom book, Behind the Veil of the 7th of July 2005. Multiple bombs. went off on the London Underground and a bus above ground as well. This is also covered in this more recent book, in one chapter of this book. I won't go into huge detail because we've done that before, but I will pull out some salient details. There are those bombings in the London Underground on the 7th of July 2005. You may well remember them. Horrific, not something to be celebrated in any way, shape, or form, but there were, and there are always terrorist attacks. Once you have the eyes to see it, you can see consistent anomalies. Now, the first one, think back to our playbook that I just mentioned a minute or two ago, and that is the terror drill beforehand. Well, there was a fellow on the day of the 7th of the 7th, 2005 in London called Peter Power, who came out. There's Peter Power, that's him, out on the radio, I think it was on the BBC or some, mainstreamy station like that, and said that he had been running a terror drill that very day in London. There he is, the year before, exactly a year before, on the BBC, running a sort of terrorist attack simulation, which was remarkably similar in almost every detail to the attacks that happened almost exactly a year later. That's haunting, isn't it? Isn't that odd? Peter Power was a former Scotland Yard drug squad officer. That's interesting. And he went on to run his own crisis consultant company called Visor. He came on the radio on the afternoon of the July the 7th, 2005, and said that the hairs were standing up on the back of his neck because at that very morning, at this exact same time that the real bombs, or the real explosions anyway, happened in the underground, killing lots of people, unfortunately, he was at the same underground stations. I'm just going to say that one more time. At the exact same 3 underground stations, he was running a terror drill for a company that had over 1,000 employees in London. At exactly the same time, at exactly the same stations, he was running this terror drill. Gosh, that's a coincidence, isn't it? Well, maybe not. Also, the fellow who wrote this book, Nicholas Kollerstrom, did first-hand research about these attacks on the London Underground. In fact, he went to one of the central London Underground stations. I can't remember which one it was, but one of the big ones, like Victoria Station or one of these ones. He went there a week after the attacks and asked them if he could get a printout of the train schedule for that day, of all the trains, and what ones were delayed and late and cancelled and blah, blah, blah. And the obliging person, the normal person, wasn't there. There was a filler person running the office, and they actually printed out the rundown of the train schedule for that day, which yielded interesting results, because the media and the police had released photos of the alleged bombers, the alleged Muslim extremists who had bombed these train stations and the bus above ground, had released photos of them. Here we go. Here's one. That's them apparently walking into Luton Station. They'd caught the train from Luton into London, and then they were supposedly they went off in different train bombs in their backpacks. You can see them wearing backpacks. And the media, the police, released this photo of them entering Luton Station, this CCTV surveillance photo, and with the date and all that kind of stuff. Yes, very except, and the narrative was built that they caught the 7:40 train into King's Cross in central London. And then they also produced photos of them in King's Cross Station after they got off that train and before they went to their other. There's a whole lot of supposed evidence that linked into them catching this 7:40 a.m. train from Luton. The only problem was that train was cancelled that day. And all the other trains on that line were very, very late. You'll see how late many of them were: 31 minutes, 23 minutes, 35 minutes. The train they supposedly caught was cancelled. The train after that, well, I think, was 25 to 30 minutes late. So there is no way, if that time-stamped image is correct of them entering Luton Station, there is no physical way, because that train was cancelled, and the next train was approximately half an hour late, there is no way they could have been at King's Cross Station at the time that the next photo produced of them by the media was time-stamped. It was not physically possible. Oops. Somebody had been manipulating evidence. And once Kollerstrom had released this original book, because it's gone through a couple of different editions, those images had to be withdrawn. They're now quite hard to find. And a new timeline, quite a difficult time, had to be constructed to position these terrorists in King's Cross Station at the right time to be able to catch their trains, and it wasn't actually physically possible. The authorities, the police, the people running this terror event had been caught out quite embarrassingly, to say the least. Of course, the media covered it up, but it was raised in English Parliament, and they did have to revise their timeline of the attacks because the evidence that they had presented up to then was clearly fraudulent. And you can read about that in great detail in this book, and also you can read about it in one of the chapters in that book. Let's move on. Let's talk about, there were also supposed terrorist attacks in Nice, the southern French city of Nice, and Munich in the south of Germany around about the same time, very close together in 2016. You may remember these attacks, or they may have just become a blur because you were being assaulted by so much of this dishonest narrative. But in 2016, there was a truck attack in Nice on the 14th of July in Nice, and then one at a shopping centre in Munich about a week later. The first interesting point that I want to raise about that, and this comes directly from Kollerstrom's book, is an interesting coincidence. There was a fellow, a journalist, and I'm putting some pretty heavy quotes around that word, called Richard Gutjahr. He was and I believe still is, a German photojournalist. He at one stage worked for CNN, and then he worked for various media outlets in Germany. Richard Gutjahr is an interesting fellow. He's married to this woman, Einat Wilf. If you want to pull her up, Ed. So Richard is married to Einat. Here she is. She's also an interesting person. Yes, they are a married couple. Richard is a journalist. Einat was a member of the Israeli parliament, but prior to that, she was a member of the Israeli military intelligence. That was originally denied, but now it's openly admitted, even in the Jerusalem Post, for example. They now admit that she was a former intelligence officer in Unit 8200. Now, why does any of that matter? Well, I'm about to tell you. So Richard Gutjahr happened by pure coincidence to be right on the scene in Nice when a truck, supposedly this truck right here, that's the one, this truck here was driven down the boulevard in Nice and committed a terrorist atrocity, mowing people down, running people over, and killing people who were promenading on the boulevard in Nice in the nice, I assume, summer weather of July 2016. Richard Gutier happened to be on the balcony. In fact, I think he probably took this photo overlooking. He was on the balcony of the Winchester Hotel, overlooking the whole scene of the crime. And his photos and video footage were the very first ones from that terrorist attack. Okay, so that's, in a sense, in an ironic sense, that's good fortune for a journalist to be on the scene of this crime as the crime is happening. That's extraordinarily good fortune for a journalist. Where it gets a little odd and a little coincidental is that Richard, a week later, when a terrorist came into a shopping center in Munich and allegedly started shooting people, Richard was also on the scene, coincidentally, and he also took the first photos of that atrocity that were released to the public. He then tried to, when people noticed that the same journalist happened a week apart to be at both of these terrorist events, some people noticed and they remarked what an extraordinary coincidence and what fortune that might be for a journalist to be a week apart, to be on the scene spontaneously and coincidentally when two terrorist attacks happen. People noticed and remarked on his good fortune as a journalist to be there for both of those. And when they did, he removed all his tweets and all his photos and tried to remove his name from being credited with all those photos that had gone around of both of those attacks. What an odd coincidence, isn't it? Now, in Nice, the oddities pile on. There's it's like a layer cake of odd coincidences and odd happenings. In his book, describes some of the photos as, in his view, clearly containing mannequins. Now, I don't wish to publish things that might be upsetting to people necessarily, though I would argue that Kollerstrom may be onto something here. You'll notice this is a photo from the scene of the crime in Nice, from this alleged truck attack. You'll notice the highly improbable angle of that leg there. Kollerstrom is arguing, I think persuasively, that that is a mannequin, that is a dummy, that is not a deceased human being. That is stagecraft, a stage prop. That angle of that leg is not possible on a human body, that is some kind of mannequin. That is his argument. Ed, we have another photo from the scene of the crime. This one, Kollerstrom argues in his book that this is also another mannequin. And I don't want to be too gory about this, but supposedly this person has been decapitated. Kollerstrom argues that is very unconvincing, and it looks like a stage prop head put next to a stage prop mannequin. In one sense, I hope that is the case. I don't celebrate people's needless deaths. Of course, in the other sense, that would mean that to some degree, thank you, John, most appreciated. That would mean to some degree that this is fraudulent. And of course, on some levels, we hope that it's fraudulent. I'm hoping people didn't die needless, horrible deaths. But on the other level, the idea that these events are to some degree fraud. I'm not saying that nobody died necessarily. I don't exactly know. But that there would appear to be some level of manipulation and fraud going on, that is also distressing, because it means that we are being manipulated on a grand scale around these events. Now, also, Ed, another thing that we mentioned in the playbook earlier on is around identity. Identity being established, the narrative being established, and identity theft actually is also another telltale sign of these fraudulent activities. And here we have, this is supposedly the ID, which was again conveniently dropped at the scene of the crime by supposedly fellow who drove the truck that supposedly rammed into people on the boulevard and killed them and injured them. Kollerstrom in his book is arguing that this is on some level a fraud. He's not sure whether nobody died there or some people died there, but also mannequins were laid out and it was some sort of potentially some sort of drill had happened where all these photographs were taken at the scene. There are witnesses who said that already blocked off and there were no people there before the truck appeared. So that's interesting. But regardless, that is supposedly the ID of the supposed truck driver who was supposedly shot by police at the scene of the crime as he was still driving the truck and ramming it into people, even though it took the police a long time to get there. And he supposedly drove his truck for over an hour down the boulevard. That must be a very long boulevard until the police finally arrived. Another sign of a fraudulent event is the police and the first responders taking an inordinate length of time to turn up. So according to some timeline and some witnesses, he was driving the truck along the boulevard for over an hour till the police arrived, and whence they shot him and killed him, apparently. And that was his ID that was dropped at the scene of the crime, except that the next day, the fellow named in that ID rang from Morocco, rang the French police, reportedly, and said, "I'm alive. That ID has been stolen from me. I am the person named there. I've got all these reporters sitting on my front doorstep. I can't leave the house. They're all asking me if I'm a terrorist, but I'm saying not. I'm also not dead." This has happened before in other terrorist cases. Mohammed Atta, whose convenient ID you saw earlier on, the day he was supposedly the ringleader of the 9/11 hijackers. The day after 9/11, he rang his father, who resides in Cairo, Egypt. His father swears that Mohammed Atta rang him the day after the 9/11 attacks, saying, "I'm alive, it's a fraud, it's a lie, I don't know what's going on, but I'm very concerned for my life. I'm going to try to hide out, but I'm concerned that I will be murdered." But never heard from him ever again. This is a recognized pattern recognition, fraudulent narratives, and even ID theft. Now, also, another element of our playbook in Nice, the destruction of evidence. So, Ed, if you would be so kind, the Nice, as do many places in the world now, unfortunately, is well covered with surveillance cameras, CCTV cameras. Nice is no different, but I remember this happening at the time, and it was ringing all sorts of alarm bells for me. Even at the time, I was like, what the hell is going on here? The French police, they didn't ask. They actually, in fact, they ordered the government of Nice to destroy all CCTV footage of this supposed terrorist attack. And they came out with the lame excuse, and there's an original French article about that from one of the major French papers, Le Figaro. The police ordered the government of Nice to destroy all their CCTV footage and images. They came out with this excuse that they didn't want any of it to leak and for it to upset relatives of the dead. But of course, that is destruction of evidence, and it's a fairly egregious, obvious case of the destruction of evidence. And I would argue, and Kollerstrom argues fairly convincingly in his book, that it's pretty typical of these. So you've got more and more destruction of evidence. Now, why ask, and this is a very obvious point, but I'm going to ask it anyway, why would you order people to destroy evidence unless you had something to hide? I know it's obvious, but it needs to be asked. Now, let's move on to Munich. As we noted earlier, the very, very, very fortunate journalist Richard Gutjahr happened to be in Munich roughly a week later. Here you can see the Einkaufszentrum, the shopping center there. And Richard happened to be on the scene coincidentally again. There are rumors that he was on the scene of at least one other of these terrorist attacks of this era as well. There are rumors about that. Here's the supposed terrorist. Of course, there were early reports that there were multiple terrorists. Another giveaway, you often hear reports of multiple terrorists. And then as they solidify the narrative, that multiple terrorists always turns into one. So here we have the Munich terrorist attack, same playbook, same journalist. They're taking the photos. Extraordinary coincidence. Quite incredible. Now, let's move on to the Charlie Hebdo attack that happened on the 7th of January 2015 in Paris. Charlie Hebdo is a French magazine. I've seen it many times when I've been in Paris in France. Even prior to these attacks, look, just my personal view, I don't mean to speak ill of the dead, but I always thought it was a particularly stupid magazine. I was always embarrassed whenever I saw it. It seemed to be there. It didn't seem, when the occasions that I flicked through it, which I did a couple of times, I always could not understand why Charlie Hebdo existed as a magazine. It seemed to be particularly stupid, and it seemed to just exist often for the purpose of defaming and stirring up Muslims. It seemed a very odd provocation. Even prior to these attacks, I had the faintest feeling that it felt like some sort of intelligence front, that magazine. Just my opinion. This attack, like I said, happened on the 7th of January 2015. Likewise, a lot of odd events and coincidences. Here is if it's real, it's a disturbing photo of a security guard or a policeman being shot by one of the assailants. People know, I won't play you the footage. I have unfortunately seen it. I don't like to see these sorts of things. But a lot of people noticed, the question I would ask, a very logical, rational question, who is in position to film this at that time? That seems odd that somebody could catch something like that. It's not impossible, but it seems fortuitous, at least, to be, up in a building and able to capture that. But also people noticed the supposed gun was possibly firing blanks because there was no recoil from the rifle or recoil, and there seemed to be no sign of head trauma or blood from the fellow who's shot at point blank range, supposedly moments after this image is taken. So people have asked, and Kollerstrom does in his book, have suggested that might be some sort of fraudulent event. It might be a staged event of some sort. There are other odd about the Charlie Hebdo. In fact, there's a multitude of odd things, and I do them all. But one of them that Kollerstrom points out in his book is Charlie Hebdo itself, the magazine. And as I said, I already had my suspicions that it was some sort of intelligence front of some sort. But he notes, and he produces documentary evidence to show it, that Charlie Hebdo, the magazine, there's some peculiar things were going on there. It had multiple addresses at the same time, and that these terrorist attacks would happen at addresses that appeared to be dormant and otherwise unused by Charlie Hebdo, and that the magazine would actually function, its genuine offices, as best that could be told or could be discerned, would be somewhere else. And it would have multiple addresses, this magazine, and the terrorist attack would happen at a particular address that, as far as could be discerned from publicly available documents, was basically dormant. That's odd, isn't it? Now, after this, actually, let's talk about the ID yet again. The supposed terrorist attackers yet again conveniently drop their ID at the scene. No, I'm not kidding. I'm not making this up. Yet again, they drop their ID cards at the scene of the crime. Extraordinary, isn't it? How thoughtful of them, so therefore the narrative can be quickly established. Within an hour of these supposed attacks, the narrative can be firmly established by the media of who is responsible, because fortunately enough, they happen to actually drop their ID cards at the scene of the crime. Who would have thunk it? That's so thoughtful of them. What happened is, after this supposed attack, and I don't know precisely what happened, but I do think it is very much open to question, the Charlie Hebdo attack. Kollerstrom suggests that it was completely staged and that possibly nobody died in that attack whatsoever. He talks about evidence, and I don't know if this is true or not true, but he does cite evidence that seems to indicate that the majority of the Charlie Hebdo editorial staff were in Peru at the time. They were not even in Paris at the time. And it is interesting that mere days after this supposedly horrific event, Charlie Hebdo can produce a new magazine. Yes, the cover you just saw, just a few days after supposedly all its editorial staff have been massacred in the most horrible fashion. It can still produce a magazine. There it is, a few days later, which is all about this attack. You'd want to ask the question, who put this magazine together? Also, Charlie Hebdo was in dire financial straits prior to this terrorist attack, yet due to the public ripples of this terrorist attack, they printed up to 3 or 4 million copies of their new edition, the new issue, which hit newsstands about a week after the attack. How is that even possible? How can you print 3 or 4 million copies of a magazine and put the magazine together and then print them in that short space of time? I'm going to argue very strongly that is not actually physically, logistically possible. You can't actually do it. There must be some premeditation involved. I'm going to go out on a limb and argue very strongly that smells to high heaven. Anyway, through the agency of the media, who of course weave their black magic spell as they always do, millions of people become animated by this supposed terrorist attack and supposedly hit the streets of Paris. You'll notice that they have, apparently I've read, millions of signs are already printed up for them. Gosh, it's almost like somebody was ready, that somebody had prepared this earlier. Millions of people hit the streets, animated by the media and the political class. They have millions of signs. Where did those signs come from and who paid for them? That's an interesting question, isn't it? But nevertheless, the narrative is established, okay? And I would argue, look, I'm going to put it straight to you. I'm going to put it square to you. The media are always lying. Even when they're telling the truth, they're lying about it because they're telling you the truth for nefarious reasons. Okay. And they're generally mostly lying most of the time. All right. This, unfortunately, is yet another example of that. Because, and you may remember this, I certainly do. There was all this hoo-ha in the media about millions of people march against Islamic terrorism, in Paris, blah, 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 blah. Leaders of the world, German Chancellor Merkel's there, the French idiot President Hollande's there, Netanyahu's there, all sorts of these bozos are there, marching at the head of the crowd in solidarity with the public, doing the right thing, locking arms, being there, in the show of solidarity with the traumatized public, doing the right thing, putting on a brave face. What splendid, courageous leaders they are. Except it was completely fraudulent. Some brave soul who probably lost their job all their life, leaked these photos, and they're now very hard to find, but they are in Kollerstrom's book, but they're very hard to find now, these photos. Leaked photos of what really happened. This is a photo op. This is a staged photo op. See, the horrid world leaders are at the front there. Then they've got extras behind them to fill out the crowd for the photo op on a cordoned off, heavily guarded, very secure street in Paris, nowhere near the rabble whatsoever. They've got their own staged photo op, which is then beamed to CNN and the BBC and the Washington Post and the New York Times and the ABC and the whole lot of the lying scumbags who presented those photos, which are fraudulent. They are absolutely fraudulent. And here's the photographic evidence. It was staged. The world leaders marching in solidarity. It's fake. It's absolutely fake. There it is. That's what actually happened. If you want it in black and white, well, color actually, but you know what I mean. If you want it, evidence, hardcore evidence of how duplicitous all of these scumbags are, and the media are the worst of the lot, there it is for you, right there. What a bunch of craven liars they all are. Okay, I'm going to admit it to you straight up. I don't believe a word they say about anything. Okay, I don't believe a word they say about the last 2.5 years. I don't believe a word they say about the last 2 decades. I believe none of it. None of it, actually. Why would you? Why would you believe anything these scumbags say to you ever? There it is. Their staged photo op and all the rest of it. All the ID that happens to flutter down from the top of the World Trade Center as it's exploding into balls of flame. The pristine ID that flutters down to be discovered by the very fortunate FBI agent who finds Muhammad Atta's ID on the street there. Yes, sure. Don't believe a word of it. Anyway, if you want more detail, it's in this book, False Flags Over Europe by Dr. Nicholas Kollerstrom, A Modern History of State Fabricated Terror. I'm going to argue that he has established his case pretty well. I'm finding that case fairly convincing. How about you? Let us know. That would be great. Now you might ask, okay, as you know, we noted at the beginning, what's that got to do with the price of oranges? Well, the war on terror, you remember this war on terror boondoggle that they bombarded us with? That had extraordinary effects on our society, okay? Especially since 9/11, we witnessed a multitude of effects, and I don't have time to list them all, but we absolutely witnessed the normalization of our countries being turned into police states. We noticed the normalization of mass surveillance of basically the entire population all the time, with no actual suspicion of wrongdoing on the population's part, but we are all essentially under surveillance always. We also noticed the militarization of police forces. Ed, I think you've got some images there of these things. You know, I've noticed this a great deal. I was out the other day at a there it is in a nutshell. This is what we were bludgeoned over the head with for 20 years, the war on freedom. It was a lie. I'm telling you, it was a lie. The whole thing was a deliberately constructed lie. And this, I thought this photo is interesting. This shows you in Australia, these are, you know, Australian police, so-called. This tells you, this cop up here, right above me, right? This is what police used to look like in Australia. The cop over there, the SWAT team guy, this is what they look like now. This is the militarization of our societies, okay? The war on terror was not against supposed Muslim radicals. It was against us. And I would argue that the war is always against us. It's actually, the war is always the elite, the string pullers, the globalists, whatever you want to call them. They're always at war against us. They just change the props around. They just change the scenery and the props. Okay? For 20 years, roughly speaking, the play, the stage show, the musical they were putting on was called The War on Terror. But it was always a war against us, you know? Yeah, thanks. Now they've moved the props around a bit. They've moved the scenery around a bit. And now we've gone into another part of the show. We're into Act 2, if you would say that. But it's still a war against us. And it always is. Okay, thank you. That's probably enough from me. If you want to see uncensored, because we're getting censored all over the place all the time, we're constantly playing whack-a-mole. If you want to see previous episodes of All Out of Bubblegum uncensored, you can see them at alloutofbubblegum.net, alloutofbubblegum.net. You can also find other things there. You can find various articles that I've written for New Dawn magazine. You can find the Forbidden Book Club episodes separated out. Thank you, Ed, for doing that. If you go to alloutofbubblegum.net, you can support this program. That would be most appreciated if you did that. Thank you if you have done that already, or thank you if you are doing that in the near future. Alloutofbubblegum.net. You can also, thank you, Mark. You can also, if you're sick of looking at my ugly mug, and I wouldn't blame you for that at all, I've got a great face for radio. You can find All Out of Bubblegum for the time being on various podcasting platforms, Spotify, blah, 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 whatever. You can find links to all that stuff at alloutofbubblegum.net. So that is your place to go for everything concerned with bubblegum. There you go. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ed. We will see you maybe at the No Goat Show tonight in St Kilda, Melbourne, Australia, or otherwise we will see you next week. Thank you.